Hello, good afternoon and good morning to another worldwide Neuro Theory Forum today with Karina Curto on a Thursday, somewhat out of the order, but we're very happy to have Karina here to talk to us today about dynamically relevant motifs and inhibition-dominated networks. Very briefly, you can, as always, put your questions either into the chat bar on your right-hand side or into the question box in the bottom of the screen. And if the questions are urgent, I will interrupt Karina to answer them during the talk. Otherwise, I'll invite you on screen to ask your questions after the talk. You can also meet with Karina in a Zoom room, in a post-talk Zoom room right after the talk, and I'll be sending out the link for that Zoom room in the chat at the end of the talk, where Karina and I, and hopefully many of you, will join us to say hello to Karina and ask more informal questions than you would like to be broadcasting on YouTube and on Twitter, as well as on Crowdcast. So, Karina got her PhD from Duke back then in string physics and in physics of string dynamics, string theory, and then switched to neuroscience right after for a postdoc at Rutgers, where Ken Harris was back then, and another postdoc with John Rinzel and Charlie Peskin at NYU at the Recurrent Institute. And then finally, Karina became a professor at Nebraska-Lincoln in 2009, and more recently switched to Penn State in 2014, where she has been a associate professor, I guess, Karina?
Yeah, I'm full now, but I was hired as this. Yeah.
She's a full professor now. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much, Karina. I would encourage you to read, by the way, Karina's Wikipedia page, because it's quite elaborate and quite nice. But without further ado, Karina, the stage is yours. Thank you for coming.
All right. Thank you. So I've never used this platform before, just so you know. I'm going to share a screen now, and I can't see anybody or anything other than my.
I'll turn my mic on if there's any interesting.
Yeah, so do interrupt, because I don't see anything or hear anybody. I mean, I can hear you. Sorry, I can hear you, but I don't see anything. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that I've been doing with collaborators and with students in the last maybe 5 years now. So, and let me just get started. So the main thing that we are interested in is really trying to understand dynamic attractors in the brain. And so let me just kind of back up, a few decades. So many of you know this story. The Hopfield model was a very influential model in the 80s and beyond. And the idea here was to model memories or encoded patterns in neural networks, in recurrent neural networks, as fixed points, as stable fixed points, really, of the dynamics. And so, the famous Hopfield result from '82 is that he was able to write down an energy function for these equations and show that regardless of initial conditions, the energy decreases along trajectories, and so you're guaranteed to converge into a stable fixed point. Okay, and so this is attractor neural networks. It's kind of I mean, they didn't start with Hopfield, and they certainly didn't end there, but it's kind of the iconic cartoon of attractor neural networks, where you imagine some energy landscape that your network is defining for you, right, via this W matrix, and your attractors really are static. So they are stable fixed points of the dynamics, okay? And so you can use this to encode static patterns like memories. People have used the Hopfield model, for instance, to encode images, like pixelated images, things like this. Anything that you can sort of think of as a static vector or a static point, that things like this can be encoded with such a model. And I'll highlight the interaction matrix, at least in the original and the most studied versions of this, is symmetric. And certainly that was necessary for this energy function result. Okay, so obviously fixed points have been used in more ways than that. So continuum attractor networks or bump attractor networks is another situation that many of you may be familiar with, where instead of having having isolated fixed points, you may have an entire line, like a line attractor, or an entire sheet, two-dimensional sheet, for instance, as in this example, for encoding position via hippocampal place cells. And this, I just want to stress, even though you're going kind of up a dimension in your attractor, it's a line or a plane or something like this, it's still consisting of a bunch of fixed points, right? In other words, if you put yourself at one of these positions, you're going to stay there unless you're perturbed. So there's not a natural movement to the attractor itself. Okay, you just have many of them. So you have a continuous family of them, but they're still individually very much like the point attractors in the previous slide. So what other kinds of attractors are important for neural computation? And, this is kind of just a fun example, but limit cycles, periodic attractors, are actually, very similar to many of the dynamic phenomena we see in neural circuits. And this is really a situation where you have a collection of neurons that are firing, for example, in some kind of sequence. In this case, it's a repeating sequence that I'm thinking of as a phone number, where these are firing rate curves. And you imagine when the probability of firing is sort of near its peak, that's when the neuron is kind of representing its number in the network. And more generally, limit cycles and these kinds of periodic attractors have been useful for modeling central pattern generator circuits and sequences in other contexts like hippocampus and so on. All of these things, you have not neurons firing at a fixed point, right? You don't have fixed point attractor dynamics, but you really have this kind of dynamic pattern, right? A repeating pattern of activity. And this is the kind of attractor that's a lot more difficult to study mathematically, but it's the one that I think is quite relevant to neuroscience, at least as relevant as the point attractors. And this is really the kind of thing that I am studying, or that my group is studying. And I should say that we are very much thinking about recurrent network dynamics. And this is just kind of a slide from Harris Carandini lab. And you can see the ideas that you have. Maybe I'll just talk through this cartoon a little bit. The idea is that you have excitatory neurons given by the colors red, green, and blue. They belong to different assemblies, you might think. And I think of these assemblies as subsets of neurons that can support attractors, right? Support some kind of pattern of behavior that is in some ways concentrated on those neurons and not on others, right? So I think that's kind of the way of thinking about cell assembly behavior, whether it's a fixed point or whether it's a dynamic pattern of activity. The point is certain neurons are involved and others aren't. Can you see my cursor? I think I've lost the ability to do let's see, back to the laser pointer. Now, do you see it? Somehow.
Still not. Yes,
now
I
see
see
it. Somehow I had the laser pointer option on, and then when I restarted, I didn't. So now, okay. So you can think of, cell assemblies in some sense as being subsets of neurons that can support its own special pattern of activity, right? And so this is kind of where I think of the attractors, the even dynamic attractors, being supported on subsets of neurons. And you can see when you this is actually real data. When you see the activity of a large population, you have all kinds of interesting rhythms and oscillations that emerge. And so this is also kind of something we have in the back of our minds as the sort of network that we're trying to envision while we're modeling. Okay, so what features of a network shape emergent dynamics? And by emergent dynamics, I'm really going to focus here on dynamic attractors. And, the short answer is lots of things, right? So, of course, we have complex synapses, intrinsic neuron dynamics, timescales, channel dynamics, axonal delays. There are different cell types that have different dynamic behaviors. Neuromodulators can play a role in changing the dynamics and even affecting effective timescales and things like that. Neurons, of course, are not point-like. They have dendrites, they have structure, the spiking is stochasticity, etc. Right? So there's a lot of stuff that one could be focused on while modeling. And let's just say I think there are, a lot of my colleagues have focused on various aspects of this, and maybe you guys as well. And so I'm not going to go there. Okay, so I'm going to try to go somewhere where I think there's a little bit more of a gap in the literature, and that is really not even in the statistics of connectivity, but in the precise pattern of connectivity. So this is really what we're after. So, we got to focus on something. And I'm not saying any of these, all of these things are important. They're clearly important. But for purposes of the theory and the modeling work that I'm doing, the real question is, how is the precise pattern of connectivity shaping dynamics? And, you can argue that that's a very important biological detail as well. We used to know very little about it. Now we know a lot more, and we're increasingly learning more and more every day, especially with connectomics. And so it becomes a question we can actually ask. How is the structure of just how neurons are connected to each other? How might that be affecting the dynamics, irrespective of all of these other complications? So here's the problem, right? So understanding how precise connectivity shapes dynamics is hard, and it's hard mathematically, actually, even in very simple cartoon models. And the reason is because essentially what we have is a high-dimensional nonlinear dynamical system, and it's difficult to predict how the network structure, how the structure of that W matrix, for example, is going to affect dynamics unless the structure is either, kind of random and has certain regular statistics to it. So of course, random matrix theory and variants of random matrix theory, things that like Larry Abbott and Kanika Rayan developed, and Chaim Sampolinsky and company. All of these things make it so that you can learn things about the dynamics from knowledge of the connectivity statistics, right? And so that's one extreme that is tractable. The other extreme that is tractable is if the connectivity is very regular or geometric. So for instance, with the bump attractor networks, you have connectivity that falls off with distance. And so there's actually a geometry that you're imposing on the network that is giving you kind of a rule for how neurons are connected. So you actually think of positions in some space, whether it be the actual locations in the brain or some feature space. And so that's another extreme where you can, in that case, you can often turn your network into a PDE or a PDE-like equation and make progress that way. Okay, so there are some extremes, either the sort of random or the very regular geometric, that allow you to make mathematical progress. And of course, many people have worked in these extremes. People like Bart Ehrmantraut and Bresloff and so on. And what we are going to try to do is really go to the middle. Okay, so we want to study kind of arbitrary connectivity graphs. Okay, so if you thinking ahead, right, to the day when we're going to have good connectome data for many networks, we want to understand how the network motifs, right, how the precise connectivity patterns may be shaping dynamics. And so we're not going to be in either of these extremes. It's not going to be random, and it's not going to be extra regular either. And the goal then is not to theorize what the structures are. So I'm not trying to tell you like, it is my theory that, you know, these particular graph structures are important for the brain. I just want to develop a general theory so that if you tell me, right, if we decide, okay, these are some important structures, there's some mathematical theory that can give you some handle on what that might mean for the dynamics, okay? So, and part of this is really developing a kind of graphical calculus where you can analyze an underlying directed graph that is encoding the connectivity of the network in some meaningful way and predict what are the emergent attractors and sequences that you might see. Okay, so that's kind of the game we're playing. And it's theory in the sense not of proposing a specific, you know, hypothesis for what the connectivity looks like. I'm not doing that. It's theory in the sense of trying to develop an understanding of how different connectivity structures would lead to different dynamics. Okay. All right. So, and the setting that I'm going to do this in is threshold linear networks, because they are, for these purposes, I think the most tractable. And hopefully these are familiar equations. These are standard firing rate models. And, you know, there's a W, there's a connectivity matrix, and there is, you know, the equations are that the rate of change of the firing rate of a neuron is, you know, is given by the inputs from all the other neurons. This is the sum weighted by the connectivity matrix, plus some theta, which is a combination of we think of as a threshold and an external input. And then there's a leak term, right? So in the absence of sufficient drive to the network or sufficient recurrent or feed forward drive, the neurons just decay to zero. And there's implicitly a time scale here governing the rate of decay of that exponential decay. And we've set it to 1, okay? And so everything, we measure units of time with respect to that time scale. Okay, so hopefully these are familiar. And, you know, we're not the first people by any stretch to study these networks and play with them computationally. So bump attractor networks have been made with various choices, you know, of W matrix here, and they've been used in a variety of settings. But I would say that the first people to really make a serious push on the mathematical theory of these equations, of these networks, were really Shi, Hanloser, and Sung, who wrote a series of beautiful papers nearly 20 years ago now. It's been so long. And they developed a theory of permitted and forbidden sets in symmetric. So let me emphasize the word symmetric here. So they worked in the symmetric setting. In other words, going back to these equations, that W matrix is symmetric, just like with the Hopfield model. And in this setting, they were able to show that these networks can function as attractor neural networks, very much like the Hopfield model. And they even write down an energy function or a Lyapunov-like function that decreases along trajectories. And they're able to show, I believe it's in this paper, they show that you're guaranteed to converge to one of the stable fixed points, or to one of the fixed points, as, you know, irrespective of initial conditions for the symmetric case. Okay, and so basically you have a, you know, the energy landscape story like with the Hopfield model in the case of TLNs. Okay, so that was important to show that these, you know, even though these are differential, these are ODEs now, it's a different setup than the traditional Hopfield model. And it's a very simple threshold linear nonlinearity. They were able to show these things. So then, you know, I guess this is all when I was in, most of this was when I was in Nebraska with colleagues, Vladimir Itzkov, who some of you may know because he also does mathematical neuroscience, and Anda Dejadatu, who's actually just a mathematician that I know from grad school, a geometer. So we actually picked up where they left off in some sense and continued to study the symmetric case, all right? And so, and then Katie Morrison, who is my current most frequent collaborator on this, came in as well near the tail end of that. And so we spent a lot of time, you know, with the intricacies of, okay, if you have, this set of patterns, how do you encode it as attractors and so on? And everything was in the case of fixed points, right? We're all in the symmetric case. We're trying to use the full power of linear algebra and related fields of geometry to actually understand how you can encode fixed points in different ways, collections of fixed points, right? Like a full neural code in networks like this. And so that was all fun. But at some point, we got bored because after all, stable fixed points isn't the whole story, right? So I was during this whole time, I also collaborated with, Eva Pastalkova and Yuri Buzaki, and, was well aware that networks produce sequences, right? There's dynamic activity. There's not that much evidence for like actual stable fixed points, right, as your attractors. There's some evidence that there's attractor, that kind of attractor-like dynamics, but I think there's even more evidence that you see attractors that are dynamic, oscillatory and so on. And in some sense, we were focused on the symmetric case because that is where the light of linear algebra shines the brightest. But then the idea, this was kind of a big shift, was to look for networks that have no stable fixed points. And at this point, we understood how the stable fixed points emerged well enough that we were actually able to rule them out. And that's sort of a fun side story. But we can actually write down, if you go back to this W matrix, there's actually a simple condition on the W matrix where you can rule out stable fixed points altogether, right? And only have dynamic attractors. Even in a case where the activity isn't blowing up, right? Where you still have bounded dynamics. So the shift now is that we're going to care about both stable and unstable fixed points, right? And the unstable fixed points are going to be the ones that are closely related to dynamic attractors. And so as it turns out, this is sort of remarkable because these equations are so simple. From these equations, you get the full range of nonlinear dynamics. In other words, not only multi-stability, which is what was demonstrated in the case of symmetric W, and that's the idea of having multiple stable fixed points, multiple static attractors, but you also get limit cycles. These are the periodic attractors. You get chaotic attractors, and you even get quasi-periodic attractors, which are the more exotic things that, for mathematicians, like irrational flow on a torus. And these are really the main categories of nonlinear dynamics, and all of this behavior arises with these very simple threshold linear equations. And in fact, they all arise even for effectively inhibitory W. So in other words, if W, and this is actually a choice that was also made by Holliser and Sung and colleagues 20 years ago, if you choose your W matrix to be effectively inhibitory, in other words, which really means that the matrix entries are all non-positive, okay, then you're guaranteed to have bounded dynamics here. So in other words, your dynamics are going to be confined to a cube where every neuron is between 0 and theta in its amplitude. And this allows you much more control. So this is the kind of situation we want to be in, at least for now, because it does allow us more control on the mathematics and on the dynamics. And so what we did was to go to a special case, okay? And the special case is going to have two features. First of all, the W matrix is going to be effectively inhibitory, meaning the entries are non-positive, but also they are going to be determined strictly from a directed graph. And this is going back to, there are many, many ingredients to a network and to neural dynamics, and we're not going to study all of them, right? We're going to focus on the feature of the network that we're most interested in, and that is the precise structure of connectivity. And so we allow for arbitrary graphs of connectivity. But the way we think about it is that these neurons, remember the picture from Harris Lab that I showed before, we think of these neurons that we're modeling, right? These colored ones that are the ones that are actually, corresponding to the indices in the equations. We think of those as excitatory neurons or principal neurons that are encoding information whose patterns of activity are sort of meaningful reflections of, memories or sensory inputs or what have you, but they're lying in kind of the sea of inhibition, right? And so there's a sort of global inhibition that's assumed, that's in the background, which in this figure is denoted by these gray neurons. And so the idea is that even if, say the yellow neuron has an excitatory connection onto the green neuron, it's also going to have an inhibitory effect on the green neuron through activating this inhibitory network that's in the background. So this is the cartoon picture, right? I'm not saying these equations are derived from a specific network like this, although it would be nice to be able to sort of know how that would yield a specific W matrix. But this is kind of the cartoon we have in mind. And so the entries of W should be thought of as a sum of background inhibition and kind of direct excitatory connections. All right. And so these are like effective interactions. And again, I'm not deriving W from any specific model like this, but I'm trying to consider kind of large families of W matrices. Ideally, I want to understand for any W matrix what's going to happen. But for now, I'm constraining myself to the situation where W is, competitive or effectively inhibitory, which means, again, the entries are non-positive. And I'm going to allow two values. So this is kind of like a binary synapse situation, but it's like two values for the effective interaction. One is going to be what we call -1 plus epsilon. Epsilon need not be small, okay? But it should be smaller than actually it should be smaller than delta over delta plus 1, in particular smaller than 1. And that's going to correspond to when we have edges in the graph, right? So an edge in the graph is going to indicate kind of a reduced level of inhibition. So there's a background global inhibition, and these guys with edges, we think that there's sort of an excitatory connection that's making it less inhibitory effectively. And then the ones where there's no edge, you have a strong inhibition. And so the graph really in this context is encoding a pattern of weak and strong inhibition. Okay, regardless of whether you buy the story that it can come from a network like this, any network you can take that's effectively inhibitory, you can associate a graph that encodes the pattern of weak and strong inhibition. And so you can think of these networks as generalized winner-take-all networks because they are competitive, but instead of having dynamics that pick out a single winner, that's winner-take-all, and even instead of having dynamics that pick out a single group of winners, really what these guys are going to do is they're going to pick out attractors, and including dynamic attractors. Okay, and so let me just show you some examples of how rich the dynamics are. Okay, so using this rule, again, now once I start with the graph and I pick an epsilon and delta, and the actual particular choices are not important. A lot of our results that we show, the theorems that we prove, for example, we can show that it's independent of the choice of epsilon and delta, provided that they satisfy these constraints. And so you can start writing down networks, right? So I just pick a graph and start looking at what happens when you simulate. All right, so I'm using these equations. W matrix, again, is determined by the graph together with parameters. And you can start simulating. And in a graph like this, for instance, it's like a small network, but it's large enough that I can show this rich variety. So depending on initial conditions, this network can have 4 different attractors. All right, so there's a coexistence of different attractors, even different types of attractors in the same network that's allowed. So for example, you can have a limit cycle, and that limit cycle is concentrated on these neurons, 2, 6, and 3. You can see these are the ones that are sort of firing strongly, and then you get maybe some little blips from neuron 5, you can see down here in the gray, and the other ones all die. And this black curve is showing the total population activity. And you see it kind of wiggles around. And so this is an attractor. This is a limit cycle attractor, and it is focused on a subset of the neurons. So that you could say this is a cell assembly, if you like, or something like this. But it's really attracting in the sense that if you start near this solution, you will get sucked into it. And in fact, here what we're doing is we're starting near the origin, but biasing towards these neurons, like you would do in a winner-take-all network, the neurons that are sort of have the highest initial conditions tend to win. And here we have that situation with the attractors. There's also a chaotic attractor that emerges that is concentrated on these three neurons, 5, 3, and 4. Note the overlap. The green neuron participates both in the limit cycle and in the chaotic attractor. Just like with traditional cell assemblies, like they can overlap and belong to distinct attractors. And we also have fixed points, stable fixed points. So these are the good old-fashioned ones, the analogs of what you would see in the Hopfield model, for example. And all of this coexists in the same network without changing anything in the equations. Okay, so in other words, I have a graph here. I've written a W matrix according to this rule, and I've simulated dynamics, and the only difference between these solutions is initial conditions, right? In other words, if I take initial conditions, that are concentrated on neurons over here, I fall into one of these fixed points. If I take initial conditions over here, I fall into the limit cycle. Initial conditions that are biased towards neurons 3, 4, and 5 fall into the chaotic attractor. And so we have basins of attraction, just like with the Hopfield model, where initial conditions determine where you fall in. But now instead of the multi-stability being between only stable fixed points, now we also have dynamic attractors in the mix, okay? And all of this is for these very simple equations, right? With a very simple rule of how to make the W matrix from the graph. Now, we also, so one of the things that's great about this setup with the graph is that you can actually study how the graph itself is shaping the dynamics and the attractors. And so one of the things I really like about looking at the graph in connection with these equations is that the graph gives us intuition. So first of all, you should note that the attractors, when you have a limit cycle, for example, it follows arrows of the graph. So here, for instance, we have a limit cycle where 2, 3, 5 oscillate, and you can really see that in the graph. On the other hand, we have some puzzles, right? So here I have a 3 cycle, it's giving me a limit cycle. I have another 3 cycle here, 1, 4, 5 in the graph, right? It's locally, it's exactly the same as this one, but it does not give me a limit cycle. Here I have a different graph where I have 2 limit cycles that emerge. Here I have a different graph with 3 fixed points, and here I have a graph that gives me 4 chaotic attractors, okay? And one thing I want to highlight, the reason I sort of put these 4 graphs together on one slide is that they have matching connectivity statistics. In other words, the degree sequence, if you look locally, so neuron 1 has in degree 1, out degree 2, 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 right? And if you look at the full set of neurons and the so-called degree sequence in each of these graphs, they are identical, okay? So you have the same number of neurons with, in degree 2, out degree 1, and so on across these graphs. So if I were just, looking at statistics of connectivity, there is no difference between A, B, C, and D. They are by design identical. And the equations are no different, right? So for each of these, I'm using exactly the same equations and moreover, the same choice of epsilon and delta. And so the edges are all identical, okay? And yet the dynamics that we see are wildly different. So it's really, so this is, it kind of shows the power of this model to really isolate what's special about the actual global connectivity structure, right? None of these differences can be attributed to local changes. The neurons are identical, the connection strengths are identical, where there's an edge, the in and out degree locally is identical. All of these graphs are locally identical, and yet dynamics are wildly different. And so there really is a lot that is shaped, that can be shaped. I'm not saying this is the only thing that happens. Many things shape dynamics in neural circuits, but there's a lot that you can do just from connectivity. And I think that's important to keep in mind, because given the complex nature of connectivity in real neural circuits, it's hard to believe that the brain doesn't take advantage of the variety of dynamics that you can get by varying the wiring alone. Okay, and let me show you just to show you how rich the dynamics can be and how surprising in some cases. Here's another sort of small graph. I show only small graphs because then we can actually trace, what the neurons are doing. But of course, these networks can be simulated for arbitrary n, and our results, our mathematical results, many of them are for kind of arbitrary size. So this one I really like because, this graph, right, and making the W matrix according to the rule produces the expected limit cycle where you go around 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's just like a rapid sequence that repeats, but also for a different set of initial conditions. Again, exactly the same equations, only changing initial conditions. You can fall into this crazy looking attractor, where the curves look like they're melting, and I call it the Gaudi attractor because it reminds me of the architect in Barcelona. And so really rich dynamics, right? Despite very, very simple structure of equations and essentially binary synapses is what we're doing here. And then here's again the same model. Now we've chosen a random W matrix that satisfies these conditions I mentioned before of no stable fixed points. So we're guaranteed to have interesting dynamic attractors, and you can see that the population activity is quite rich. And if you squint, it looks a little bit like the real data, but I won't make too much out of that. And then I said that we get the full range of nonlinear dynamics, and the last sort of exotic type of attractor is the quasi-periodic attractor. And here, this is a graph that produces it. You can see again, just like with the Gaudi, we have the simple limit cycle that you expect from going around the outside. And I've projected that here in red. That's the limit cycle. This is an unstable fixed point associated to that limit cycle. In other words, if I perturb around this unstable fixed point, I fall into this limit cycle. But then there are different initial conditions that take me into this quasi-periodic attractor that traces out a torus in 7-dimensional space. So this is a 7-dimensional system, and I've obviously projected it onto a plane so that we can look at it. And you see that you have this beautiful torus-like structure, and that's really the hallmark of a quasi-periodic attractor. Okay, so how do we analyze these things? Where's the math come in? And the real key is to think of TLNs, and I'm thinking of TLNs more generally. I'm not necessarily in this combinatorial regime where I'm just looking at graphs. And I'm looking at a general W matrix. And the cool thing about these is that you can really think of them as piecewise linear. So in other words, in these brackets, right, there's an equation that defines actually a hyperplane. So if you think of, x1 through xn are coordinates in n-dimensional state space. And the row of the W matrix, right? This expression is like the dot product of the ith row of the W matrix with the x column vector. That is acting like a normal vector to a hyperplane. And then the theta provides a shift. So these equations, right, when I look at them as a system, really give me a hyperplane arrangement. So there are n hyperplanes, defined by y1 equals 0, y2 equals 0, et cetera. And these hyperplanes tell me which side of the nonlinearity that I'm on, right? So in other words, I have a point in my state space, and once I choose a particular set of values for x1 through xn, I will be on the plus or on the minus side of each of these hyperplanes. And when I'm on the plus side, I get to drop the brackets, right? Because the threshold linear function is, after all, just identity function on the plus side. And when I'm on the minus side, I set it to 0. And so at a given point in state space, we actually have a linear system of ODEs, okay? But the trick is that you have these hyperplanes define these chambers. They create these walls, and as you cross the wall, you go into a different linear system of ODEs. So the TLNs can really be thought of as a patchwork of linear systems in the sort of n-dimensional state space. And one of the immediate consequences of this observation is that there's a one-to-one correspondence between fixed points and allowed supports. So in other words, given a subset of neurons, say x1, x3, and x5, right, there is either a fixed point supported on all three, a single one, or none. And so you really can label the fixed points by the allowed fixed point supports, and that becomes the game. And so we're gonna, the way we study these networks, sort of the main way, is by studying these fixed points and how we can understand the fixed points for a network from the graph structure. And so just to convince you that unstable fixed points have a role in the dynamics, in the case of where going back to the combinatorial special case model, where we have binary synapses, in the case of the 3-cycle, the dynamics really oscillate like this in a 3-cycle fashion. And this network has a single fixed point. It's unstable. Here I'm showing those hyperplanes for y1 equals 0, y2 equals 0, y3 equals 0. And there's a single unstable fixed point. And what happens is that if you perturb from that, you get this spiral out behavior. And then you start moving into different chambers. So the change in color here is indicating different chambers of this hyperplane arrangement that you're in. And so the limit cycle really emerges because you leave the central chamber, but then when you come back in, you're kind of catching the spiral out at an earlier point in the spiral. And so this patches together to get you a perfect limit cycle. This is a mechanism that I had actually never seen before for creating a limit cycle. And it's really something that can happen in these piecewise linear systems like this. So I'm a little bit short on time, so maybe I'll skip this. But for those of you who know what a Hop bifurcation is, this is actually the kind of thing that we're seeing here. So there's a as you change parameters, right? So here we're changing this delta parameter, which is controlling the strength of the global inhibition. As you change this delta parameter, you go from having a stable fixed point in the 3-cycle case to then getting a spiral in behavior, then what's called a center fixed point, and then the spiral out. And the spiral out is really the regime that we have constrained ourselves to, when I showed before that epsilon has to be less than delta over delta plus 1. And so that's what's happening here, right? And so this is a generic behavior independent of the specific choice of epsilon and delta, provided it's in the right regime. Okay, and then, those of you who have seen the Lorentz attractor before may have noticed that there are these unstable fixed points, kind of the eye of these hurricane-like spirals, right, in the case of the Lorentz attractor. And this is the same kind of thing that we're seeing in our network. So I showed before a network that has these chaotic attractors, and this is like the projections of the 4 chaotic attractors. And you can see also you have these unstable fixed points here that have a stable direction in, okay? So there's a direction where you get sucked in, but then as you get near this, there's sort of a plane where you have a complex conjugate pair of eigenvalues that spiral you out. All right, so fixed points are important, and knowing about the fixed points tells us about the dynamic attractors. And so, but it's not all the fixed points. And so through studying these graphs and proving theorems about how the graph structure is giving us fixed points, which is, at this point, we have a long list of what we call graph rules to do that. But I want to focus now on some newer stuff, which is that we have recognized that there are special subgraphs where we can expect a unique fixed point that has full support. And so, for instance, this 3-cycle is special, right? The 3-cycle is special, and so are other cycles, and so are other structures, where basically what happens is we're not going to have lots and lots of fixed points associated to that subgraph. We only have a single fixed point, and it's involving all the neurons. And it turns out, this is sort of initially it was a very heuristic observation, and now we're kind of checking it computationally in a systematic way. It turns out that these core motifs tend to have associated attractors to them that survive when the core motif is embedded in the full network, if and only if the associated fixed point survives. So in other words, you have these subgraphs, they have a full support fixed point associated with them, no other fixed point. In the subnetwork, there is an attractor, and then you want to know when does that attractor survive to the full network. And so if we test the rule of thumb, let me just show you in a very particular example here. We saw this network before where we had the coexistence of these 4 attractors, right? And I didn't tell you how we found them and how we know that they're the only ones. But it turns out that if you look in this network and you can find the core motifs using these graph rules that I'm not going into details on, but basically a pure graphical analysis tells me which of these subgraphs has that property that they support a single full support fixed point. And so this is the full list. And you've noticed I've X'd some of them out. And the ones that I've crossed out are the ones where, because of the way the network is embedded in the larger network, those fixed points are not surviving. So for example, 2, 3, 5, this little 3 cycle here, is embedded in such a way, it's actually because node 6 is receiving 2 edges from it, that I know from graph rules, that these graph rules that we've developed, that fixed point will not survive to be a fixed point of the full network. And so, so we can determine, this is like a pen and paper calculation, right? To analyze this graph, find the core motifs, figure out which ones are going to survive. And we can reduce this now really with a pen and paper analysis, no simulations, just using the theorems. We can reduce it to this list of 4 core motifs that are surviving, that have surviving fixed points. So I'm just using the rule of thumb and the theory and the mathematical theory here. And then the remarkable thing is that every one of these core motifs has a corresponding attractor. And it is exactly these that we saw before. So 4-8 is corresponding to the stable fixed point. 1-8-9 is the stable fixed point. And 2-3-6 and 3-4-5 are these two dynamic attractors respectively, where you can see the core motif is really the collection of the high firing neurons, right? And there are still the underlying ones are low firing ones that kind of get recruited in to the attractor. But the main ones are the ones given by this core motif. All right, so we obviously haven't only done this in this example. In fact, for non-isomorphic oriented graphs with no sinks on n up to 5 neurons, we found that this rule of thumb correctly predicts the set of attractors corresponding to core motifs for nearly all the graphs. And furthermore, we have now sort of identified larger core motifs. So I've shown you the 3 cycle. The clicks are all core motifs. They're kind of boring. They correspond to stable fixed points in the dynamics. 4 cycle, but here at size 4, we start to get some more interesting ones. So these graphs, this one, and this one, they all are core motifs as well, meaning, right, in an isolated setting, they produce their own little attractor of dynamics, but then I can embed them in larger networks, and I have a rule for predicting when the attractor is going to survive. And so here you see this attractor has this nice sequence. Neuron 1 fires, then 2 and 3 fire synchronously, then 4, and then and the sequence repeats. This one is very similar, but it has the difference is this back edge from 2 to 1. And this one down here on the left, on the lower left, is a very interesting one. It's a core motif, so there's a single unstable fixed point that gives rise to this attractor. This is a global attractor, actually, for this subnetwork. And it's what we call a fusion attractor, because actually there's a 3 cycle here. It's 1, 2, 3. And there's also this neuron 4, which on its own would give you just a stable fixed point. And the attractor that we get here is like a fusion of the two. It's almost like a binding, right, of the 2 states, of the stable fixed point and the 3 cycle. And we see this kind of behavior all the time when we have sort of bidirectional connections between one subgraph and another one. It's almost like they're two attractors associated to the different pieces get fused together. So we call it a fusion attractor. And then going up to n equal 5, this is the one that gave me the Gaudi attractor, and also this more boring sequential one. So that's a core motif as well. Of course, we have a cycle, but then we have these more exciting ones down at the bottom. Okay, so recently we did this tour de force where we tried to test the rule of thumb, not just on oriented graphs, but on all n equal 5 graphs. And in case you didn't know this, there are 9,608 non-isomorphic directed graphs on 5 neurons. Okay, so if you want to really look at all the graphs, non-isomorphic, right? So so this is actually a non-trivial list that other people have compiled, right? So this is available online by professional graph theorists, so to speak, who have compiled all the full list of non-isomorphic graphs. But for each of these graphs, right, we can analyze them. Again, automating our sort of pen and paper type analysis, we can figure out core motifs and which ones we expect to have surviving fixed points, and then we can test if those attractors are there. And it turns out that in, again, nearly all of the graphs, so 9,586, I think, out of 9,608, that we found the rule of thumb works. Okay, in other words, we can predict the emergent dynamic attractors in nearly all the graphs. And in the ones that we can't predict, we actually have sort of a good handle on what's exceptional, what's going wrong. And so we can predict what the attractors are going to be. And of this, nearly 10,000 graphs, it turns out that a little over 1,000 actually have core motifs that give rise to dynamic attractors. And we observe some of them have multiple dynamic attractors. We observe a total of 1,130 dynamic attractors in these graphs. And here's the striking thing. Many of them are really the same. Okay, so there's a modularity to the dynamic attractors. And I will show you that next. I think I want to, let's see, these movies are a little, I don't know if I can play this. I might have to change my screen share. Oh, here we go. Okay, so it's a very striking thing that I want to show you, because of course, fixed points look kind of the same. You can put the same fixed point in different networks. But these dynamic attractors, there's no reason to expect. Remember, we have the system of equations. We have this high dimensional state space. There's no reason to expect that the dynamic attractors can be the same across different dynamical systems. But they really are. And I want to give you a flavor of that. Okay, so here's that fusion attractor I told you about before. So I have the 3 cycle, 1, 2, 3. This is the 4th node, and I have the double edges, and I get this nice fusion attractor. Now, these stripy colors in the back, if someone asks, I can give more details, but these are actually just tracking the null chamber. So basically that state space that I was talking about, where the neurons are living in, at any point in time, you can track which neurons are increasing, which are decreasing, and kind of label that with a binary vector, and then we turn that into colors. It's just a way of being able to see how similar the attractors are in terms of the trajectory moving through the state space. And here at the bottom left is a projection. So I've initialized all of these near an unstable fixed point. You can see the spiral out behavior, and then the red is the last half of the trajectory that I'm projecting, so that you can see that it really has settled into a limit cycle. Okay, so pay attention to the red. That's really the attractor. And again, these are 5-dimensional trajectories projected onto a 2-dimensional plane, and and we can see the limit cycle dynamics by the fact that we get this clean closed curve. So it's a repeating trajectory, and of course the repetitiveness of it is also viewable by eye by looking at the rate curves here. Okay, so now I'm going to play this movie, and what I want you to pay attention to is how the graph is changing. all right? So every graph will be different, and it's going to, of course, correspond to a different dynamical system, right? There's a different set of equations, a different W matrix, because the graph is different. And yet, these attractors are all going to be the same. You'll see a little bit of shift because of the transient behavior is going to shift the timing of when you fall into the attractor, but otherwise the attractors look exactly the same. So you see the graph is changing. That node 5 is always dead, even though sometimes it gets edges in, sometimes it only has edges out, right? It has a complicated interaction with the rest of the network, and yet in all of these cases, it dies at the attractor, and the attractor is identical. Okay, so it's really striking because these equations are changing significantly. That W matrix, I mean, it's not just that it's not just the stuff related in the row of this fifth node, right? I mean, because edges are coming out and into these other nodes, which is tilting their hyperplanes. So the dynamical system is, even geometrically, it looks like it's changing quite a bit. And yet this attractor stays exactly the same. Okay, this particular attractor. Some of these networks have multiple attractors. So for example, let's go back to this one. You see that red node is a sink. So this particular network, I can tell you, is also going to have a stable fixed point with a different basin of attraction, right? So some of these have multi-stability, but this particular attractor is due to this particular core motif supported on neurons 1 through 4. And based on our graph rules, we know exactly when that core motif is expected to survive. And so the way that I was able to put this together, remember there are nearly 10,000 graphs. And just because a graph has the same core motif doesn't mean it's aligned properly, right? So you won't see the colors being identical unless you properly align the graphs to each other. The reason we were able to do this, right, is because of our understanding of the theory. So we know how to align the graphs and which graphs we expect to have the same attractor in. And so that we could pull out, based on the theory, a collection of graphs that all should have this attractor. And we also know where to initialize. What initial condition? Because the initial condition is really given by perturbing from the fixed point associated to that core motif. And so we can really see that and then we verify computationally, indeed, they all have the same attractor. I'll give you one more example of this. So this is a different core motif that we saw before actually, and it has this kind of attractor with nodes 2 and 3 firing synchronously. Here is the projection. And again, pay attention to how much the graph is changing, right? These are all different dynamical systems. And yet the theory has told us that these graphs will all produce this attractor. So there really is a modularity to the attractors, right? In other words, there is this potential, just like with fixed points in the Hopfield model, for example, there really is this potential with these networks that you could embed specific attractors and have them, look the same, right? Even though they're living in very different networks, even though they're embedded in different ways. And I think that's actually really interesting, right? Because somehow we have these networks in the brain or across brains, right? Your brain and my brain, like the network is very different, but somehow you can embed the same dynamic pattern of activity in 2 different networks. Because there is this sort of modularity, like the structure of the dynamics can actually be preserved to a striking degree. And this is due to the inhibition-dominated nature of the network. Without that, I don't think this would be possible. Okay, so this is not like a standard thing in dynamical systems that you can see exactly the same attractor across different sets of equations. That's not a standard thing. It's really a remarkable fact, and it's actually something that the specific structure of inhibition domination gives you. And then just to give you like a little flavor, I'll wrap up very quickly here, of the variety of attractors that we see. It's hard to go back. So here, this is a movie where I'm just showing one representative. So again, we had 10,000 graphs, 1,000 of them have dynamic attractors, but only about 40 distinct types of attractors do we see. And even those break up into families. And so here I'm showing one example of each kind of attractor that we see. And so these are, by design, should all be different, right? But even subtle differences, we're making these distinctions because we have attractors that are really the same on the nose. We classify as different whenever there's actually a subtle difference even in the attractors. And sometimes we have very big differences like this. So, so anyway, there's a variety. This, of course, is for n equal 5, but the way that the embedding of the size 4 guys in the size 5, those rules extend to networks of arbitrary size. So 5 is a way to sort of test all the possible embeddings of the size 4 guys, but they extend. Okay, now I just have like one more pair of slides. Do I have a couple minutes? I started a little bit late, but
You're doing absolutely fine.
Okay.
No stress.
Okay, so let me I don't like going over them. So let me just end by saying, all right, so we have this really pretty story where we can understand the attractors for this, where we have a good understanding, at least in these small motifs, of how the attractors embed in larger networks and so on. And you may wonder, how much does this generalize, right? So a lot of people ask me, well, what if you change the transfer function? What if you go to spiking networks? What if there's so many things we can change about the equations, right? And it is true that the mathematics, right, the theorems that we have proven depend, for now, on the specifics of the equations. However, I've been encouraged by the fact that other models, right, with similar graph structure are producing very similar dynamics. So this is an example out of left field, right? So this is a paper that's coming from ecology, okay? So these are people studying evolution and ecology, and they are asking questions about species diversity, right? So I think the main question that they think about is, how can a collection of species coexist, like we see in nature, right? Because many of the simple models you might write down for species competition would have a winner-take-all behavior where, one species wins, and then you would expect a world where you have just one kind of animal and everyone else is dead or something. And so obviously that's not the case, and so there's something wrong with the models. And some of the more recent models that, again, I'm not an expert in this field, but I learned a little bit about it because of this connection. Some of the most recent models are these non-hierarchical species competition models. In other words, you can have, this is like a generalized rock, paper, scissors game, if you know what that is. And so game theorists have thought about this for a while. Also, like voting, there's the voting paradox, if you've heard of things like that. It comes from these non-hierarchical models where you really can have pairwise, for every pair of species or candidates or whatever, right, you have a domination relationship. So for instance, yellow dominates red, blue dominates red, but red dominates green, right? And so you have these different pairwise domination relationships, but there's no overall hierarchy. You can't say, this is the dominant species for the entire thing, because it will be dominated by someone else. And you have these loops like purple, red, and blue, right, form a loop that you can think of as like a rock, paper, scissors game kind of loop of domination pattern. And so, these graphs, so again, here we have directed graphs, and you can look at a discrete model here where you have, so here they've done a simulation where they begin with 25,000 individuals. I think I've lost my pointer again. Let me bring it back. Here we go. They've done a simulation where they have 25,000 individuals, and they assign species at random, and then they pull out at every time step, they pick a pair of individuals, and then they check. If it's red and blue, then blue wins and captures the individual from red. And then so you do this for like 1 million time steps, or 10 million or something, 10 to the 7, I think is what they said. They repeat this 10 million times. And they come up with these curves, right, which is the population dynamics over time. Okay, so they're trying to see, and there are, ecosystems where you see oscillations in the population dynamics like this. And so they see these kinds of, attractor dynamics in a sense, And this is what they're trying to study, and this is a mechanism for species to coexist. So we took this model, we took the same graph, and just made a threshold linear network from it, right? Using exactly the same equations, exactly the same parameters we were playing with to make the W matrix. From the same graph, I even matched the colors, right? So that we could compare directly the curves. And in our system of ODEs, right, which is not very different from, not derived from this model. In fact, you can derive ODEs from this model, and they are different from the ODEs you get from our system. But these are the threshold linear network ODEs. We end up getting this pattern of activity. And you can see here that red, green, and yellow are firing synchronously. They're right on top of each other. Here, they're a little bit spread out because there's stochasticity in this model, but it's exactly the same kind of pattern. And then we also see the sort of high firing, or the high population nodes. Now, you might say, okay, we have blue and purple. They have blue and yellow here. So the colors are not matching, even though I matched the graph. It turns out their figure has a typo in it. And you can actually check over here. The purple should be the high firing one. The blue and the purple, this is like taking average population activity. They actually should have blue and purple being the high firing ones. And these three should be the same. And you can actually, so I know this for sure. Well, first of all, because we implemented their model and checked that indeed there's a typo in their figure in terms of the color here. But also you have a symmetry of the graph. So yellow, green, and red, there's actually a graph automorphism that permutes these. And so they really should be the same. Obviously here they're the same up to stochasticity. And in our case, we have a deterministic model, so they're exactly the same. So the point is, there's something about the competitive nature, right? And the graph structure that's controlling the strong and weak competition that is leading to dynamics that are somehow independent of the specific details of the equations that we wrote down. So we actually believe there's something a little more universal here about the kind. Obviously, the precise details are dependent on the model, but there's I mean, we've now checked many graphs with this discrete species competition model, and it's even that Gaudi attractor shows up. They didn't discover it, but we can see it from their equations. So I think I want to end the talk here. So I will just flip through these slides very quickly to get to the end. But we have all these graph rules. So there are theorems that tell us how we can figure out those networks, those fixed points, and predict the attractors. We've used some of these to model different phenomena like central pattern generators, and that phone number network we can generate this way. And then we're working on all kinds of applications related to sequential activity and generating sequences with a mechanism that's like quite different from something like a SynFire chain, but also in a way that we can predict with the theory. And I think I will just end here. And I want to thank my main collaborators. So I've already talked about Anda and Vladimir, who were collaborators on the earlier stuff with the symmetric W matrices. And once I started working on the non-symmetric case with the dynamic attractors, really Katie Morrison at the University of Northern Colorado has been kind of my main, I mean, she's like the co-PI on everything. So I like to give special thanks to her. Chris and Jesse were postdocs that we had for a couple of years, and now they've moved on. Chris is currently in Tatiana Engel's lab at Cold Spring Harbor. Caitlin Parmalee is a former grad student of mine who's an assistant professor now at Keene State. And then Caitlin, Juliana, and Josh are all current grad students who are working on bits and pieces of this story. And with that, I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to share these slides, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karina. I've already invited a couple of people who have questions onto the screen,
Okay.
but while we're waiting, someone just showed up. So I guess, Christopheros, you can ask your first question.
Yes.
Should I stop? Sorry, should I stop sharing or should
I can do that. Hold on, I can just unfocus your screen and then we'll be bigger. There you go.
I can't. Okay, should I? I need to
Oh
stop.
yeah, just exit your slideshow, then you can see us.
Because I can't see anybody. Okay, good. Yep. Hello.
Hello, Karina.
Go ahead, Christopher.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, the question is the different classes of inhibitory neurons in sensory cortex are thought to follow a specific connectivity pattern, and we call it the canonical microcircuit of the cortex. Would you suggest, though, to investigate their dynamics, the dynamics of this microcircuit through this framework, since in cortex usually we consider it to be excitation dominant and not inhibition dominant?
Yeah, so this might not be, so I would say this particular, these particular results, right, do really depend on inhibition dominant. The tools that we've developed to prove these theorems we know that they can be extended beyond that regime. It's just simpler, right? It's simpler to assume the inhibition domination for proving a lot of the theorems. But many of them we do know can be extended. And so I would say before investigating a circuit that you know to be dominated by excitation as opposed to inhibition, wait, wait, because we are actually trying to extend this to situations where the excitation is stronger than the inhibition, or at least on some connections, right? So the matrix shouldn't be all non-positive; it should allow positive connections as well, positive entries as well as negative entries. So that is still, but that's still in the future. That's a good question, though. There is a tremendous variety of inhibitory neurons.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Peter Jonas has another question.
Hello. Thank you very much for the stimulating talk. I guess I want to understand the difference between the entorhinal cortex and the CA3 area of the hippocampus. The first one generating apparently continuous attractor behavior to produce grid cell activity, and the second one probably generating more discrete fixed points to retrieve memory. So can you give me a hint of what the differences in circuit motif structure you would expect to generate these differences?
Yeah, so I think, so the entorhinal cortex, the grid cells versus the place cells is very interesting. So in the case where you have more of the continuum attractor dynamics, I would expect the connectivity to be more symmetric, right? So usually when you have these bump attractor networks and so on, that W matrix is like, it's symmetric or approximately symmetric in some way. I mean, you have to define what that means. Also, it's distance dependent, right? And so you do have an underlying geometry. I would expect in the entorhinal cortex that there is some geometric organization to the neurons, right? In the sense that the connections are going to drop off with distance.
That's very exciting, because in CA3, in our multi-cell recording measurements, we found very little evidence for distance dependence in a network which, according to what we know, would produce discrete states. So you're saying that this would favor probably the emergence of these discrete states.
Yeah, so I would say, right, exactly. So I'm aware of in the CA3, you don't have this distance dependent story. It's not simple like that. And so, yeah, so I think that would favor, that's more like the kind of arbitrary graph structure, right? That's not geometric. So that is what I would expect, to be kind of the main difference. Sort of underlying geometric organization that gives you the very regular grid patterns and the symmetry versus a more ad hoc, I don't know, for lack of a better word, a different kind of connectivity.
Thank you very much. I have more questions. I may go to the chat to discuss with you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
See you in the Zoom room. We do have time for a few more questions. The most upvoted question was by Stefano, possibly Stefano Fusi, not sure. Do you expect these findings to extend to graphs with larger number of neurons? For instance, can you use the rule of thumb for networks with more than 100 neurons?
Yes, right. So the rule of thumb is really good for certain core motifs and not as good for others. So for instance, something really simple like the 3-cycle. So we have tested it in networks of like 1,000 neurons. We haven't gone much more than that, but just, just to get really a variety of embeddings. And it does work really well. You would never find that attractor just once you have these really large networks that they have many limit cycles in it, it's very difficult to find the attractor, except the rule of thumb tells us how to, right? And so we can actually find it because the rule of thumb not only tells us that the attractor survives if the fixed point survives, it also tells us how to find it, that it's tied to the fixed point, so that if you perturb around that unstable fixed point, you will fall into it. So that makes it actually not so hard to test. So what we've done is we've taken, those n=3 and n=4 core motifs, and we've embedded them randomly in larger networks, and then we've just tested for the one attractor that we expect and whether its survival is tied to the fixed point survival. So it works very well for the 3-cycle, the 4-cycle, the fusion guy, the one where it was, so for various of these, it works really well. For some of the other core motifs, it works not so well because we don't understand the rule as well. So in some cases, yes. In other cases, we need to do a little more work to figure out, because it's not just the fixed point survival. The rule is actually more complicated than that. The fixed point survival is sort of the simple, heuristic, but we are actually working on a more refined rule to really understand that. And that's part of why we did this n=5 case, because then we could really...
Maybe connected to this, I was wondering if, like, for small networks, I assume that they're not very robust. So if you kill off one neuron, then all the dynamics will change a lot.
Yeah, well, that depends, right? So what I was showing when I showed all those graphs changing, right? You really can kill off connections and kill off neurons and preserve the dynamics in many cases, right? But it's not. It matters how you do it. So when I showed those movies, right, where it's like the same attractor, that really is a situation where you're like killing a neuron or killing edges, right, and getting exactly the same attractor, exactly the same dynamics. So it is robust, but with the caveat that you have to understand what are the
which ones you can kill.
Right, you have to, right, and so it's not anything. And so we do have situations where like one edge difference or throwing back an extra edge can completely change the dynamics, and other cases where it doesn't do anything.
But
right.
So the question was for me then, if you go into bigger networks, are they going to be more robust? Like, so even that the number of crucial edges will go down?
Right. So I think that if you go, let's see, it depends on the attractor, right? So like we think of the attractors as supported on these subsets of neurons. Okay, so when you go to large networks, one question is, all right, the small ones, right, supported on these little small networks, do they survive? And the other question is, what are the new large things that come up, right? And so in terms of the small things, their robustness, it doesn't really make a difference how large the network they're in is. Provided they survive, they will be robust, right? But it's the larger things, right, that we don't understand how they might depend on the intricacies. On the other hand, you might not care about the intricacies of those attractors either, right? What you care about is like, is it periodic? Is it chaotic? Is it, how many neurons does it involve? And so there might be coarse features of the attractors that are robust. But we've been talking about sort of like the robustness in terms of the actual fine level dynamics in the small case, because we can.
I'm just going to power through a few more questions because I have time with you later, so I have the privilege of continuing. But regarding connectomic data, what amount of connectomic data, volume or synapses, would suffice to develop such a mathematical model and prove that it's indeed correct? I think, given that you're looking at very small networks, probably not a lot. But have you tried looking at connectomics data to see if you get these kind of motifs?
So I think, so I've talked to people who look at motifs, right? And I think the main sort of, I think the thing that one could do at this point is not so much try to build an exact network that's going to match, some particular system or some particular network in connectomic data. I think what this work is telling us is certain graph structures to look for, right? So in other words, it is a kind of analysis, right, that one can do and that people do on connectomic data is, okay, once I have some graph of connections, let's hunt for motifs, for overrepresented motifs, right? So if you think about work like Mitja Shklovsky and people like that have done, they look for overrepresented motifs. Now, once you have those overrepresented motifs and the underrepresented ones, what do you do with it, right? What is the meaning of it? How might they be shaping the dynamics? And so I think this work gives you, I mean, the small motif work gives you a mechanism for maybe reading some meaning into those motifs, right? And thinking about how they might be shaping the dynamics.
Yeah.
So that would be the sort of first point of comparison that I've talked to people about. So.
In the dynamics you showed, the neurons often do not reach zero firing rate, meaning the nonlinearity is rarely at play. What's the consequence of considering dynamics with sparse activation?
Yeah, so it's not that the nonlinearity is rare. I mean, the nonlinearity is kicking in all the time, actually. But the nonlinearity kicks in when the stuff inside the brackets is positive, right? When the stuff inside the brackets goes negative, right, then that goes to zero and you get this exponential decay. So you still see the neuron above zero, right, unless it gets to decay all the way. And so it's not that it's, I mean, you really are crossing, you wouldn't get limit cycles if the nonlinearity were not at play, right? So it's actually at play all the time. And when you saw, actually, when I was showing my movies, you saw these colored stripes in the background.
Yeah.
Every time the color changes, you're hitting a wall. Okay. Every time that color changes, your dynamics are transitioning between different chambers. Okay, so it's absolutely at play all the time.
Karina, I think we're going to stop here. There's a few more questions, but I know the askers are coming into the Zoom room, so they can ask in person. And I would like to say thank you again here and invite you to come to the Zoom room right after this. It's in the chat, but it's also in the email that you received with your schedule. And yeah, I'll see you in the Zoom room as well.
Okay.
Thanks again.
All right. Bye.
On the other side.
Mm-hmm.